Okay, hey everybody, welcome to another episode of On the Wrist from Off the Cuff. Today we have a really awesome review for you from the brand Formex Swiss watches. Now, a little bit about them. They were established back in 1999, and essentially they're actually based out of Biel, Switzerland, which is known as the cradle of Swiss watchmaking. Just so you guys know, a little bit of foreshadowing. This is probably one of the more Swiss timepieces you will ever see on the channel because they really take it to the next level as far as their Swissness goes. It's not one of those things where it's kind of the bare minimum. These guys are Swiss to the max, and I gotta say I am very, very impressed. Now, basically that area where they're based out of is actually a place where there's a language boundary between French-speaking and German-speaking parts of Switzerland, and basically it's bilingual throughout. So their name Formex, basically form extreme, is French for an extreme shape. And you will notice that within their watches, they are very extreme and very different and have tons of personality. And this is actually probably one of their, I'd say, more versatile pieces because it's a little bit toned down, it's a little bit stripped down, but man, this thing still has a ton of personality and is insanely good. A little bit more about the Formex background. Basically, they're founded by two Swiss brothers, both watchmakers and enthusiasts alike. They wanted to combine their passion for watches with their love for motorsport, essentially, and they were inspired by the engineering and mechanics of high-performance racing cars and bikes. The two brothers basically developed the brand's signature patented case suspension system, which you guys will see featured here in this review. And basically that cushion-like system protects the watch's movement and considerably adds comfort while on the wrist, while giving every Formex a very distinctive, robust, and sporty aesthetic. So with all that said, let's go ahead and take a closer look at this fine timepiece. Okay. As you can see, this thing is definitely a looker. It's really quite gorgeous. This model is actually called the Essence Automatic, and this is their chronometer spec. And of course, with the blue dial variant. The type of watch this is an everyday watch, and when you're looking for an everyday watch, some key common characteristics in design language, you're basically going to want that versatile blend of sporty and dressy attributes, which I think this really nails. It's definitely sporty in its design, but because of the high level of execution on the finishing, the fit on here, I mean, it's pretty breathtaking, guys. This thing is not approaching luxury. This is definitely a luxury level of finishing here. The fit and finish is absolutely outstanding, and this is probably one of the finest watches I've actually ever featured on the channel. This thing is insane. So this is called the Essence again, and basically a little bit about that. It's their whole idea was to combine elegance with robustness and really study what it means to have the best of both worlds. So this thing is that crossover, exactly like I was talking about, trying to be an everyday watch, right? And then one of the big features is that it really it has cool things that make it functional, not just the form, right, isn't just extreme, but the function is actually quite extreme because, check that out, you have toolless spring bars there, which is great. So you can actually change out the bracelet quite easily. And then you even have things like this little trick clasp where you can actually add a little extension there, as you can see, and then you get it all closed up. And you can even give yourself basically a little half link of adjustment if your wrist begins to swell. So very cool from that standpoint. And I mean, this bracelet is just gorgeous, individually articulated, guys. Look at that, individually beveled, just finished. Oh my gosh, all the way through. And then you even have screwed links for those of you that are real sticklers for that. And one thing that I will highlight is check out the suspension on the case. And you'll see when I do some flexing on the wrist how that works out as well. But it's very cool, and definitely adds that little bit of just, you know, there's more to it. It's not your basic watch that's in this price range. And speaking of the price, if you want this version on Bracelet, the COSC model, it's $12.65, or you can get it on leather or rubber strap for a lot less, for $11.60. And then if you want the non-COSC variants, it really jumps down, and you're looking at in between $8.90 on Bracelet or $7.85 on strap. And the straps are outstanding, guys. Let's take a quick look at this guy here. So as you can see, here's the strap. Also quick release, so you don't need any tools. We have the forged carbon fiber. It's something I can really appreciate. I think, you know, on camera, you're really not going to pick it up. It just looks like kind of a matte piece of, you know, material there. But it's actually quite beautiful. I mean, as somebody who's actually into cars and motorsports, forged carbon fiber is something that came out recently. I know typically you think of woven carbon fiber, but essentially, I believe it was Lamborghini that came up with kind of the marbled forged carbon fiber idea, which was just taking shreds of carbon fiber and actually pressure, adding pressure, and then the resin to form it. And it's essentially super strong and super light, of course. And one of the nice things, again, you have with the form is you get the function factor. So this is all very lightweight, and then you even have, again, a very cool micro adjust, which is awesome. So as your wrist begins to swell a little bit, you don't have to worry about pulling this out, rerouting it through. Essentially, you can give yourself a little bit, even on, like literally on the wrist, like let's say, you can press this button and you can adjust it that way and give yourself a little bit more room, which is just a beautiful feature. And it's insane that more people haven't taken the time, and more manufacturers. And then, of course, again, look at the finishing on this thing. Brushed with a high polished bevel. This clasp is finished nicer than a lot of watches, you know, that are under $1,000, and even some that are over $1,000, guys. Because at the end of the day, is it easier for you to just fully brush it or add a fine bevel with a great brushing? So it's always going to be harder, and they're showing you basically, you know, their technical prowess with little details like that. So that's really outstanding. But I love this thing on the Bracelet, so of course I'm going to focus on it on the Bracelet. I'll switch to some wrist shots and do some little quick changeover so you guys, I'll take the gloves off so it'll be a little bit easier to handle everything. But just to get back into this timepiece, of course the specs did go across the screen in the beginning of the video, but it's actually 43 millimeters. And it's very, very deceptive, guys. This thing does not wear like a 43 millimeter watch. That's basically an Oris Aquis. And I'd say it tricks you a lot of the ways like an Oris Aquis will wear, because I mean, I have an Aquis, I love it. But yeah, 43 millimeters, especially when you're thinking of something that's not a dive watch, an everyday watch, that feels big on paper. But I have to tell you, the 10 millimeter thickness on here, that height, really helps this thing balance. Also, it's only 49 millimeters lug to lug. Of course, it's full 316L stainless steel, brushed and polished, hand finished, guys. So that's why you're gonna see such fine finishing on there. Look at that sharpness in that high polished bevel transition in between the brushed and polished finishing. This thing, whew, it's tough to really explain how good this thing is in hand. So we already talked about a little bit about that suspension. Of course, it does have a sapphire crystal, and you can see you can almost reach in and touch the dial. It definitely does a great job of negotiating, you know, reflections with that inner air coating there. You can see as we get up very close, you get a nice idea of just how piercing that blue dial is. Now, the bezel is, of course, fixed. It does have this nice high polished area. And this, the kind of sloping nature of the design. I mean, this thing feels like, just like it has that supercar, hypercar feel to it. I mean, this is like wearing a Lamborghini on your wrist. Yes, it's a little bit wider, you know, when you think about 43 millimeters, but because it's so low slung, right? It's thin, it's low to the ground. You don't look at a Lamborghini and necessarily think, wow, this is such a huge car. It's because it's not. because it makes up for it in being so low slung, and because of the thinness here, you know, at that 10 millimeter height, it's kind of has that same low slung nature because of the curvaceous nature here, the overall shape on the case, the fine bevelings. What it does is it just gives you this impression of it just being built for speed and aerodynamics and just wrapping around your wrist. So even at the larger size, it just wears so much better than other I mean, this thing wears better than 39s I've worn. So it's just, it's kind of nuts. And I'm hoping that once I get it on wrist, the camera will be able to really showcase that, because that was probably my biggest reservation, was the size on paper. But once I got it on wrist, I was absolutely blown away by how well it wears. As far as the crown goes, it is, I wouldn't call it signed, but it's definitely not plain, right? It does have some decoration on it there with the matching, basically, little hex bolt, and then which matches actually the bolts that go around the little suspension that's on the case. And it's very nice. It's not screw down, but at this point, you know, it's not meant to be a dive or anything like that. I'm not hurt that it's not a screw down crown. It's always nice. It's a nice safety feature, but this still does have 10 bar, 100 meters of water resistance. So there are seals in here. It's not like they just, you know, just screwed everything down and then said, okay, well, don't submerge it in water. There's definitely been a fair amount of engineering, of course, all the way around the timepiece. So when somebody with this level of execution does something, you kind of are a little bit quicker to believe them, right? Of course, I'm not going to go diving or try to submerge this watch, but any rigors of things splashing, you know, just being out in the rain, you know, even some light water sports, I'm not worried about this timepiece. I think it's, I mean, I might be worried about how gorgeous it looks and getting like salt water on it maybe, but I mean, other than that, this thing is definitely just built like an absolute tank, and quite a sexy stretch lowered low slung tank at that. Now the movement, of course, inside is a Sleeta SW200. It is chronometer certified, but one of the things that makes it a little bit different than most watches in this price range, not only is it chronometer certified, it's actually chronometer grade. So this is a higher grade of movement, guys. There's a lot of other brands, to include, of course, even the Swatch brands, that will take a Labrador grade and even you know, standard grade movements, and basically all they're doing is just regulating the hell out of them to meet chronometer status. Now, as you go through the different grades, basically what it does is it closes the gap, right? You're getting better and better timing, and essentially this is going to be easier to regulate because it's just a higher grade and already performs within higher tolerances. Some other things you're going to get is better decoration. You're going to get, of course, blued screws, and then here you're going to see that custom rotor with the blued screws as well, nicely setting it off. So this isn't, you know, your standard affair, you know, let's throw some paint on it or some etching. They definitely went the extra mile and are giving you something that is actually, I think, worth a nice look through that beautiful display case back. So of course it is running between -4 and +6 seconds a day, and that's just a range. That's for it to meet chronometer specs. This for me is probably running closer to, I don't know, minus nothing a day. It's just been on point. I'd say in about 2 days, I notice it can be maybe a second behind after 2 or 3 days. But it is definitely wearing really well. And then, of course, depending on the positions and whatnot, if I have it laying down on a desk, then it's going to decide if it's actually, you know, depending on the positional variance, if it's going to be just sitting dial up, I've actually found it to be about a second fast, you know, 3-4 days later. But this thing is just really fine-tuned. Power reserve, 38-hour power reserve, which is pretty standard for this movement, as well as, of course, the ETA 2824, which it's based off of. As far as the dial goes, guys, let's just take a close look at this dial. This thing's gorgeous. You can see it has that vertical brushing with the machined horizontal lines, which I think really add just such a beautiful level of dimension. I think the blue color there is just so pure, so nice. No hints of purple or anything like that. That is a true dark blue navy dial, and I dig it. You have the applied indices, which are finely detailed in finish. You have, of course, that handset, which is actually polished and brushed. And they do have brushed accents on there, which are great as far as capturing that light and really illuminating the dial for automatic legibility. You do, of course, have the date complication at 6 o'clock. It is, on a white disc, which is pretty traditional for a blue dial to have the white disc with the black font. The Lume is BGW9 Super Luminova, so it is going to glow that cool blue tone very nicely. Of course, you can see it's not trying to be some big Lume beast. It's not a diver or anything like that. So as far as the application goes, it's definitely more on a refined note versus something where that's not really where they're trying to sell you is by it having thick globs of Lume applied. But let's actually get this piece on wrist and talk about more about this beautiful bracelet. All right, guys, check it out on my 7 1/4 inch wrist. Wears really well. It just drapes and wraps. Check that out. Look at the way the light dances off of those individual articulated links. Very nice. Razor's edge when it comes to that beveling. So this does have a 22 millimeter lug width, and then it tapers down to 20 millimeters. And I think that really also helps visually. This watch, I think, wears well as it does. I think if they went with something like a 20 millimeter, it would make the basically the case seem a lot larger in contrast when you think about kind of those perfect ratios when you're looking at kind of the way that a watch is going to wear, the way that it's going to appear visually. I think, of course, the way it wears is very nice, but I think the way it visually spreads the weight with its dimensions and its proportions are ultimately a huge part of the success of how well this thing wears. Look at the flatness on that. The 10 millimeters just wrapped, just draped around the wrist. This thing is built for speed. Let me give it a couple of wrist little lunges there. You can see you just get a little bit more comfort. There's some more flex there, which is great. And then also, of course, at the end of the day, if you're playing sports with this thing, you're getting a little bit of shock resistance too, which I think is really a nice feature that a lot of places that you do something corny like putting some type of plastic movement holder in there and saying that's adding shock resistance. Not these guys, not Formex guys. So very cool. I mean, obviously with the theme of a mechanical watch, having that, mechanized suspension is also, I think, just very fitting. As far as the deployant clasp there, as you can see, very nicely done. Quite symmetrical and beautiful. Everything just fits together, and of course this is not some off-the-shelf piece you're going to see on a bunch of other watches. This is something that they've engineered from the ground up, essentially like the rest of the watch. So very, very cool. Really, really loving this one. Let's actually move into getting it switched over for you guys. I'll actually change up the camera so we can get a closer look while I'm handling the watch and actually setting that up for you. Okay, guys, as you can see, we have it laid down. We have the clasp fully opened, and now you can see the bracelet. I just basically take these two posts, pinch them together, and bam, it's just straight up falls out. That is just a beautiful thing. And then other side, boom. So now you have this beautiful bracelet, very easily removed. You have the case all on its own, and then you have, of course, here we go with getting the strap on. So of course, with the curved, because this does have curvature, so it's going to have a basically it's going to have that fitted end, which does add a little bit of, you have to have some finesse when you're setting this piece in, because it's not like here where basically you line everything up and you just drop it in and everything aligns. Here, you're gonna just have to finesse it a little bit when you're actually getting your strap in. Basically, you're going to press, and then you get it lined in, and then essentially you gotta get it here. You gotta kind of dance around a little bit until you can get it in there. Sometimes it works very quickly. Sometimes it gives you a little bit, of course, of play trying to figure out exactly where that other hole is. Sometimes I'll actually even take a look at it here on the other side. There we go. So you can see it found its way in essentially. So what I'll do is I'll do that for the other side now, and then I'll give you guys a quick wrist shot with the actual strap on my wrist. All right, guys, as you can see on my 7¼ wrist, this thing wraps really beautifully. And I think if any of you had any reservations about how thick this mechanism is, as you can see, this thing just lays, everything just tucks and lays very, very nicely in there. And then basically what you do is you press the little button. If you need to add a little bit of space for you, boom. And it looks no different, from the outside. So that's a very, very nice feature, especially, I mean, for somebody like me, my wrist does swell with the heat. Even in the studio here, when I do have just, the studio lights on me, it does get pretty warm here in my little office space. So really nice. Of course, still wears beautifully. Everything is nice and flat. And then to kind of give you an idea of how everything comes apart, here you go, boom. You can see here again, you see that? Basically, press it again. You can tighten it very beautifully. Then you can undo it. It's fully open now. So you do have a really great amount of adjustability and wearability that's been added. This is very cool with the forged carbon fiber. Very strong, you can't hurt it or anything like that. It's very, very nicely done. And of course, it's very, very lightweight, which is also great and does perfectly tie in to this timepiece, and of course its overall theme, which is something that's a big deal for me, is how everything kind of comes together, because there's a lot of watches that are out there that are just spec monsters, and on paper they're the greatest watch, but at the end of the day, if it's not a desirable watch, then it doesn't matter how good the specs are. And I think that's really what Formex has done, which makes them very different from a lot of those brands that just chase the numbers, because not only do you have the numbers, they've really put together something that just hits every point. So let's actually get this piece set up for some low light transition, Lume shots, and closing thoughts. All right, go ahead and hit the lights here. As you can see, that BGW9 Lume looks great, but it is pretty thinly applied from a facing standpoint, because everything is quite finessed there with the very fine handset and indices. Of course, these aren't really big, bright, bold indices, but I think although they're thin from kind of side to side, the depth, I think really shows through with the performance of the BGW9. You can see how brightly that it's going. But one thing I'm very, very excited about is showing you guys some low light transition, because you're not always going to be looking at your watch in direct sunlight. Studio lights, which do a good job of imitating direct sunlight. Sometimes you're going to be coming in and out of the building, whatnot, in and out of a vehicle. And what I like to do is really show you how this watch renders as far as the color in the dial, the textures there, the readability and transitional lighting, so you can see just how crisp everything still is. Quite fine. And another thing is that those studio lights do a good job of actually washing out a lot of imperfections. So when you look at some harsher lighting conditions where there's just a higher contrast, and you're able to kind of get a better look at some of those fine details in the structure, in that brushing, it kind of gives away some telltale signs. Here in this case, guys, look at the way the light uniformly dances off of that brushing and just glides across, and how that finishing on the polish is just beautiful and sharp still. Really, really nicely done. I mean, this thing just packs an absolute wallop. I'm in love with this thing. This is actually a gorgeous, gorgeous piece. It does this really great thing where, you know, again, it wears so much smaller than you expected in kind of the way that a Lamborghini is smaller than you'd expect because of how low slung it is, although it's going to be wider than, of course, your typical sedan or sports car. Kind of that thoughtful execution of proportions. It carries all that visual impact with its fine details because it gives you a lot to look at still with its finishing and that execution without it being kind of over the top, which I think is great. As far as model variants go, there's black dial, blue dial, silver dial variations available in both standard and COSC. As far as comparable models go, you know, there are comparable models by price point. I could say, you know, there are other watches that are in the $1,200, you know, to $1,000 range, $1,200 to $1,500 range that are great watches. But when it comes to kind of comparing the feature sets, this watch is really in a class of its own. It just delivers on such a high level. I think it's one of the first watches that we've seen on the channel that really have that combination of not just innovation, but the refinement as well. I mean, there's been other watches on the channel that offer you a lot of bang per buck, but just don't offer quite the refinement of, you know, some higher end watches. This has the refinement of higher end watches, but also has that innovative tip that you're getting from, you know, being a smaller brand, a smaller independent brand. So I really love kind of the merging of the worlds, and then the fact that it's still quite affordable is great. I mean, for me, this piece in hand, it feels like you could charge $2,500, $2,800 for this, and it's amazing that you can get it for, you know, $1,265, and you're getting it, you know, from the manufacturer, you're getting it fully covered, you know, versus some type of gray market comparison. You take a close gray market comparison of a Swatch Group brand watch to try to find similar specs, and you're gonna have to be gray market to get close to this, and I think that's really cool and very telling that the Formex brand, they really mean it when they are talking about that kind of direct to consumer, cut out the middleman, that connection. They take that money, they save it, and they put it towards the watch. So really, you know, bottom line, the Essence nails its elegance and robust theme and really executes at an honestly luxury level. Its combination of specs, design, execution, you know, fit and finish, and value proposition, it really puts it at the very top of anything and everything else around $1,000, which is crazy because even if you get the non-COSC model, you're still getting basically the same watch with just, you know, an unregulated movement, a slightly different dial, but everything that's like amazing about this watch, you're still getting, and now you're even getting it for well under $1,000, which is nuts. You're still getting all that technology, so that's pretty crazy. I mean, there's things that this video has run pretty long because I'm just kind of flabbergasted about how good this watch is. There's things I didn't even get to mention, like they're using ceramic ball bearings in the clasp versus just steel. So that's another great thing, right? So there's just extra technology. There's just so much that's been presented here for this timepiece that's just very, very impressive. So with all that said, do let me know what you guys think in the comments below. If you like the video, please do hit like, and if you haven't already, please subscribe for more content just like this. Thanks, guys.